Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the IFG Tafseer, session 15. And in the true spirit of a stand-up comedy show, which this is in no way similar to, I'm going to hand over to Mohsin to talk you through about what's going to happen and just a bit of background on what we've been up to. Mohsin is currently, in terms of picture, he's not available because he's crouched behind some kind of vehicle in a war-torn area in the northwest of England. But I'll hand over to Mohsin to explain further.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to session 15, or indeed, if you're listening on the podcast, it will be episode 35 of the Millionaire Muslim podcast. And yes, I'm currently, not quite as glamorously as Ibrahim mentioned there, but I'm currently sat outside in my car because that's the only place in my house that I can get some peace from my kids. So in the true spirit of hustle, here I am, and the neighbors are going to look at me in a very funny way because I've got a microphone, some earphones, and a laptop open, and it all looks slightly suspect. But anyway, here we are, and it's going to be, inshallah, really, really useful tafsir today, all about charity and how we should give charity and what a Quranic charity would look like if we were to set one up from the bottom up. So inshallah, that's going to be really helpful, and that links quite nicely to a recent article that we released on charity, and Ibrahim rather controversially entitled it "Muslims are doing charity wrong." So if ever there were an article on charity that you need to read, then you should definitely read that as a supplement to this episode, inshallah. And the other thing that we did was we released a supplemental article to our zakat guide on investments, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that we had done, and we've got really good feedback on, alhamdulillah. So read the article if you've not got the zakat guide, because it kind of runs, it's a bit of a primer, if you like, to the zakat guide. It runs through three key areas of property, shares, and what was the other one? Anyway, whatever it is, it's on the article, so you'll find it. And once you've read that, give us a shout. We'll send you the zakat guide, inshallah, and that will be very, very useful. The other thing that I've mentioned before that we have progressed on, alhamdulillah, is our wills. So the wills are ticking along nicely. People are sending in their will requests and getting their wills back promptly. Again, alhamdulillah, really good feedback on that side. We're coming to the end of Ramadan now, or depending on when you're listening to this, but as we speak live, we are coming to the end of Ramadan, and now is as good a time as any, really, to sort things like that out. So definitely, inshallah, if you're one of those people like me, like Ibrahim, like lots of the people that we've come across who, they've always wanted to sort their will out. They know that they need to sort their will out, but it's the sort of thing that gets put off day after day and week after week, month after month. And before you know it, you've gone 5, 10, 15 years without a will, which is no place really that we want to be. So check out wills.islamicfinanceguru.com. It's a very, very intuitive process. You sit at home or wherever you want to sit. You can be like me and sit in your car and do it if you want. And you go through a questionnaire that's very intuitive, very straightforward. And inshallah, you will have everything done and dusted from your end within 30 minutes. And then you leave it to us and we get something back to you within a week. So inshallah, if you have thought about doing a will and you've not yet done one, then definitely take some action, inshallah, and go to wills.islamicfinanceguru.com. So without further ado, I think I will hand over to the main man, Ibrahim, and he will talk all about what the Quran has to say about charity.
Jazakallahu khairan, Mohsin. And Jazakallah khair for tuning in. I know how hard it is when you've got kids to sort this all out. I'm sure at some point in the background we're going to hear Suleiman's dulcet tones wanting to participate in this tafsir. He's been, at one point I think he broke in and he basically just wanted to join into the tafsir. So I'm sure
maybe that's how we go. Maybe that's how this gets viral, like the guy on BBC, that interviewer.
yeah. Alhamdulillah. Well, welcome everyone to the Millionaire Muslim podcast. This is a podcast by IslamicFinanceGuru.com. We discuss halal investments, personal finance, entrepreneurship, and ways that will kickstart you into being the best version of yourself, inshallah, or at least a better version of yourself. In Mohsin and my case, we also give you a spiritual kick with these tafseers, regular tafseers on business and finance and entrepreneurship focused topics. And today we are on tafseer session 15. And today we're going to be talking about, and it's entitled, Doing Charity the Truly Quranic Way. So we're in the month of Ramadan right now, and it's the month of charity, right? And there's a huge amount of donating going on and a huge amount of WhatsApp traffic. And amidst that, there is the annual charity bashing activities going on as well. So we've all seen, those WhatsApp messages going around that attack one charity or another. And then you've got those counter arguments from the various people from those charities saying, actually, no, we're good guys. And then there's that whole back and forth. And people who have no idea about charity and have not taken the time to really research it are wading into this debate. So we wanted to really just go back to the Quran on this and go back and tease out the Quranic approach to charity and think about how we can be more effective with our charity ourselves. And it wasn't actually planned to do this on charity this week, but just as it happens, as we were going through the Quran, the verses that we're looking at today are the verses on charity, and so we thought we'd talk about that. So what are we going to be covering? So in today's podcast, we're going to be covering three things. The first is why charity is such a big deal in Islam. And the second is, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasize not reminding people about charity given? What's that all about? And then finally, what spending from the best, as we are enjoined to by the verses that we're going to look at, looks like? What does that actually look like? And so we're going to dive in today into this long passage, and we're not going to be reading all of this passage today, but we're going to be breaking it down into segments. It's a passage that starts in Surah Baqarah at verse 261, and I recommend that all of you check it out. And if you're not watching this live, then actually, feel free to go away and properly read the entire passage, because that will be really beneficial. It goes up to verse 274, if I remember correctly, or 275. And the verse immediately after that, very interestingly, is a verse on interest and the banning of interest. And we'll definitely be covering that and talking about that in detail. But it's interesting to see that counterpoint between charity and interest. So let's dive in then, inshallah, on the first of those three topics. And why is charity such a big deal in Islam? But in order to segue really into this topic, I wanted to talk about a story. So this is a story about the hadith of Bukhari, where there are three people who are on a journey and they go into a cave because perhaps it was raining, I think, at the time. And they, when they are in this cave, a boulder falls in front of the cave and it blocks them in completely. And you can imagine when you're in this pitch black darkness, you have absolutely no idea how you're going to get out. You explore the back of the cave, as I'm sure they might have done, and you discover that it's completely a dead end. There's no way that you can get out from that side. And the panic that you must feel at that time, complete darkness, you're miles away from anywhere, no one's going to pass by this place. And at this point, who do you have to turn to? Well, the only person, the only entity you can turn to at this point is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what these people did. So each of them, they remembered the most sincere action that they could, the best of their actions, the creme de la creme of their actions. And they put that forward to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the thing that would perhaps convince Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant them salvation. And one of these people, he mentions the story of an employee that he had. So this was an employee who used to help him with his sheep and his lamb and his flock and looking after them. And this employee, he worked for this individual, but for reasons that are unknown, he decided that he didn't want to take his wages, or he forgot to take his wages, and he left and he traveled far away. And the employer, this guy, was left with his wages. So what did he do? He kept hold of those wages. He didn't waste those wages. He didn't just eat them up himself. He invested those wages into further flock, more sheep, more lamb, more goats, more camels, etc. And this flock really prospered. This person's wage led to a flock that really grew very quickly, and soon it became a vast amount of flock. And you could see a valley full of these animals that had just grown from breeding and giving birth, and perhaps buying and selling a few of the crop, and then buying some more crop, etc., etc., etc. And then many years passed, and this person, he came back. This employee, he came back finally, and he said to the employer, and he said, "Where's my wages? I want my wages." And the employer said that all that you see in front of you, this valley, he took them to the valley. He said, "Look at all of these flocks, and these are all yours." And the employee, he looked at him, and you can imagine this happening at our workplace, where perhaps you if you're, like, for example, a footballer at Bolton, they force you to take a holiday on your salary 1 week or 1 month because of cash flow issues. And so the next week and the next month, imagine if they say, actually, instead of your salary of £2,000 or £4,000, whatever it is, we're going to give you we take you out into the car park, and there's 10 of these BMWs lined up, and say, "This is all yours." You can imagine that you look at them and you'd be like, what? Why are you why are you messing around with me? Just give me my wages. And this is exactly what the employee said. He said, "Why are you messing around with me?" He said, "No, I'm not. This is your wages, and please feel free to take them." And so the employee, he said, "Fine, I'm calling your bluff." And he took the entire flock. This guy, who had a small amount of wages to actually take at the start, which had grown to a massive flock, he absolutely spared nothing. He took the entire amount and he walked off. And the person said, he supplicated, he said, "Oh Allah, oh Allah, oh Lord, if I did this seeking only for your pleasure, then do relieve us of our distress." And because of what he said, the rock, this heavy rock that was blocking the cave, moved ever so slightly, and that combined with the other 2 people who had gone as well, led to these people escaping and led to their salvation. So the question really is, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he like this a lot? Why did he like this? And today we want to look at the verses on charity and really explore the question about why. And Mohsin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what we've discussed as well.
Yeah, really, really fascinating story, and a really fascinating hadith as well. A question came to mind as I was reading it and listening to it. This is reading from the hadith before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ is narrating about a time before his companions. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I mean, you don't have to answer this now, but an interesting fiqh question, given the Sharia as it is to today. What would the fiqh approach be now if we were in a position where we had an employee whose salary he, for whatever reason he hadn't taken it? Would it even be permissible, for example, to invest it? And what would we do with all that? Because I know that the fiqh on things like lost money is really vast and complicated, and I'm wondering if this sort of falls into that sort of category.
Interesting question. So I think that it doesn't fall into the category of lost property, because it's not really lost property, really, is it? It's money that's not been claimed. You know whose it is, and the person who's holding it is very clear as well. So I don't think that's the right analysis. I think here there's something to be said about investing it, to be honest, after a certain period of time, and that is because of inflation. So I don't think back in the day, when you had gold and silver as the currency, inflation was as much of a concern. But today we've got inflation, and so if your employee decides to disappear for a long period of time, and you're left holding this money, then you need to potentially invest it for him. And it is an interesting question, to be honest, because at a certain point, then this becomes a bit of a headache for you as well, because you don't want to necessarily be holding on to this money. And if you're a large employer, you don't. This is going to require a lot of administration and just making sure that this money is accounted for properly, and that could be quite difficult. So I think that there might be, if it's really becoming onerous upon this upon the company, then it might be that they take the best option for them out of a number of options that are available to them. So it might be that they decide to go for a really, rather than actively managing this money and trying to make this grow itself, they just put it into some kind of tracker or just something that is very low maintenance, instead of doing something particularly exciting about it. But yeah, those are my kind of immediate thoughts on that question. So turning back to this verse, then, to this hadith then, about this individual. So the point here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he really liked the sincerity of this individual, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he really liked the fact that this individual had that real iman and that sincerity to set up, in essence, what is a waqf for this person. So a waqf is a pool of money that is held for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's held fi sabilillah. So this particular pot of money was not necessarily a pure waqf in that sense, but it was a pot of money that this person was holding on trust for this other individual, and he was just really sincerely looking after it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he really liked that. So what is it about charity? And let's now get into the verse that we're going to be looking at today. What is it about charity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he really likes? But first, let's actually look at the verse and look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about how much he likes this verse, how much he likes charity. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم مثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. The example of those who spend their wealth in the way of Allah is like a seed of grain which grows 7 spikes, and in each spike is 100 grains, and Allah multiplies his reward for whom he wills, and Allah is all encompassing and knowing. So this is the verse about the impact that charity can have and the vast reward that is associated with charity. So you've got this seed, and this seed gives rise to this seed gives rise to a shoot that comes up, and as a result of that shoot becomes it has 7 spikes, and in each of these spikes is 100 further grains, and then these grains are eaten by us, or then they might fall down to the ground and might fertilize again. But the point Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making, from one seed you get 100, and then you get 7 of those, so 700 times the reward. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is saying that there is an immense amount of reward associated with charity. And we all know this, right? We all know this. We've all heard this reward aspect before. We all know about this. But the thing that I really want to focus us on, and Mohsin, it'd be great for you to just chip in when you're just thinking away about this, is why is that? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he give us so much reward for charity? What is it about charity that makes it so special? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really encourage charity and make us focus on charity? He could have chosen anything else. He could have chosen any other kind of worship or any other kind of action, but it was charity specifically. And this is something that we find in the ahadith as well. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he saw a man who gave a camel that had a bridle on it, and this man gave the camel for charity. And Rasulullah he said that لَتَأْتِيَنَّ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ بِسَبْعِمِيَّ نَاقَةٍ مَخْتُومَةٍ. So he said that on the day of judgment you will come with 700 of these camels that are bridled as well. So this 700 figure, this massive amount of multiplication idea, is found in the hadith as well. So what is it about charity? So one thing that when I was thinking about it, I found really useful was this idea that it is the externalizing of the principle of harm prevention from just ourselves to others. So let's just unpack that for a second. What does that mean? So there's that hadith, as we all know, الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن يرحم من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء. The merciful ones, الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن. The merciful ones are the ones that the merciful shows mercy. Irhamu man fil ard. So show mercy to those who are on the earth. Yarhamkum man fis sama. And the one who is in the heavens will show mercy to you as a result of that. So mercy is something that is really encouraged. And so what is it about this principle of harm prevention that we're talking about here? So what is going on here is that we show mercy to ourselves. We show rahmah to ourselves, and that is the motivation that seeks us from preventing harm to ourselves. So we don't step out into the middle of the road when a car is coming, because we know that's going to cause us damage. And if we see our child in the middle of the road, we will pull him out of the way because we don't want that child to get harmed. Or we see our wife and she's not aware of it, we'll push her out of the way or pull her out of the way and get her out of harm's way. And if we see another individual, perhaps we as a result of that will also do the same thing. And then we have these concentric circles of rahmah that go wider and wider and wider. So when we decide that we're going to spend some money on our neighbor, that's not like spending money on ourselves. That's not like spending money on our wife or our children. It's further than that, right? And what if we then decide that we want to go on a litter picking campaign for this community? That's further than that even, right? What if we decide that we want to set up a charity for the homeless in London? So that's even further than our locale. And then it can go further and further and further. And so the point I'm making here is that this idea of self-preservation, this idea of preventing harm, is fundamental to a human being. And when you increase that circle, you are not just showing mercy to yourself, but you're showing mercy to more and more and more people. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was known as the rahmatul lil alameen, the mercy for all of mankind. So that's, the best kind of mercy that you can, the vastest kind of mercy that you can get. And so charity is a way that gets us showing that mercy, and charity is a way that gets us increasing our levels of iman and our levels of getting to that level of rahmah that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam he had. And so that's the first thing I think that is truly one of the secrets of charity, that charity helps you get to a higher level of iman and a higher level of self-actualization as a Muslim than any other kind of activity. So the other thing that I think is really important is that charity has a wonderful ability to leave a vast and lasting impact. So there's that hadith, as we just talked about the person who invested his employees' wages, and how that left for a number of years actually resulted in a huge amount of money. And charity, when it's done cleverly and properly, has that ability to have a vast impact. If you can very effectively pinpoint the key things that are holding back a community, and you address those key things specifically, then actually what ends up happening is you have a huge impact. So, for example, there was a study, very systematic scientific approach taken to improving education standards in a certain area of Africa. And they tried a bunch of different things. They tried giving books. They tried increasing the number of teachers. They tried increasing the number of classrooms. They tried education of parents. They tried a whole bunch of different things. But actually, when they tried this one thing, it had the most amount of impact ever compared to everything else. And it wasn't the most intuitive of things. And it was basically that they gave, I believe, anti-malaria tablets, or they gave some kind of inoculation against a worm that would get into the kids, and it would mean that they would have to miss school for a number of weeks, and it meant that they became really unwell and they could potentially die as well at sometimes. So when they dealt that one issue, that actually had the biggest possible impact that they could possibly have had. And it's not the most intuitive of things, right? If you said to someone, I want you to spend money on books for kids in schools, that makes sense, right? That's like, all right, okay, I understand that's a good thing to do. Why not? Let's buy them some books on Biff, Chip, and Floppy, and the usual suspects. But no, that's not the most impactful thing. So if someone came to you and said, all right, I want you to give me some money into helping deworm these kids in school regularly, or to inoculate them against deworm so that they don't need to be dewormed and miss school, that is a much less intuitive sell, right? And so we need to think about the way we give charity, and how truly we are going back to the real value that charity has in Islam, which is the impact that it can have, the vast impact that it can have, the huge lasting legacy that it can leave. Because, why are we focusing on kids in this particular instance and their education? This is a non-Muslim study, but the reason why they were focusing on that was they too can see that actually focusing on kids can lead to a whole lifetime of activity, and that's really beneficial. So there's this impact thing that really is important and that we need to focus on. And Mohsin, feel free to jump in whenever you feel the urge. So Mohsin is like, if any of you have seen those Pakistani mushairas where they're doing poetry and stuff, and at a certain point, there's one of the key poets in that mushaira. He just gets moved to start just versifying, and he just gets up and he just goes for it, and the crowd goes absolutely wild. So Mohsin is the equivalent of that in these tafsir sessions, where he'll suddenly enter and people will be amazed.
Yeah, no pressure then, no pressure. I had I had two observations actually. So one was that it's an example. So going back to your first point about charity and why does Allah emphasize charity? I mean, it seems to me that it's an example of course, Allah is the creator of us and our psyche, and He understands everything about our psyche, and we as humans completely need to be incentivized about stuff, and we need to hear all these hadith and all these nice stories about how charity doesn't decrease your wealth, charity has this much reward, charity does this, charity does that. And why is that the case? And it seems to me that because charity is it's an example of the fact that Islam is such a practical deen. It's a deen that's rooted in societal goings on, and all of this charitable giving is without doubt important in society. And how do you make sure that that kind of that virtuous giving, how do you ensure that it happens? Well, you make sure that the people who are in control of actually making that happen are well incentivized to do that. Would, for example, Muslims be so giving in charity were it not for the extensive hadith and ayat and so on about the virtues of charity? I'm not sure that we would be. And that must stem from the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who he's the creator of us, and he completely understands us, and that's why we are so geared towards and focused on giving in charity. There is, of course, a secular element to charity giving. Lots of non-Muslims give charity, lots of atheists give charity, but not to the extent that Muslims do, and it must have something to do with the fact that we're so well incentivized to do that. The second observation that I was going to make was going to your point about impactful. I was going to say impactful investing, but it's impactful charity giving, and it's in many ways the same thing. It's easy for us as Muslims, and we often bash this sort of charity, but it's not intentional. We don't intend to bash this sort of charity giving, but I'll say it anyway. We, as human beings, we feel good about giving charity to a well in Africa, or whatever good cause that we often see being raised. Feel good about giving to that charity. And my anecdotal experience, it's not kind of data based or anything like that, but my anecdotal experience is that the reason a lot of charities like this get good funds raised is because the story is really good, the story is really nice, and it completely relates to, as you mentioned, your kind of logical human side. There is this idea that I'm going to hand over my 20 quid, this school is going to get built in Africa, and kids are going to get educated. That is completely rational. It completely makes sense. And you will find that I would strongly suspect that if me and you went out on the street and did a test case for, I'm building a school in Africa, can you give me some money? We would raise more money than something that might be far more impactful, like the example that you gave. And it's, in my opinion, I think this is, and I think you touch on this in your article as well. So it's not a new point that we're making, but it's a point that's common, that we as a Muslim community, and arguably as a Muslim ummah, are just not very good at thinking about charity from a very strategic perspective, from actually sitting down and saying what is the things, or what are the things that we need to tackle, and then how do we take 5-10 steps backwards from that problem to actually get to the root of it. And there's a decent example that I was giving to a friend the other day, actually, of the England football team, where we, as a football nation, were absolutely terrible. I mean, on paper, we were great. We had all these great players, Beckham and so on. But as a nation, we just weren't performing in World Cups. And what the FA did is they took a step back and they thought, okay, what is really going on here? It's it's a lot of things, really. A lot of it was to do with resource. A lot of it was to do with football education. A lot of it was to do with lack of tournament know-how and experience. And they identified lots of problems. And what did they actually do? They invested a hell of a lot of money about 15 or so years ago into infrastructure. So they built the St George's Centre in London at a cost of, I don't know the exact figures, but many hundreds of millions, I would imagine. And they really started focusing on youth and grassroots football, as they call it. So the football that we play up and down the streets in the country, and developing that side of things. And lo and behold, here we are 15-20 years later, and we've got probably the best football team that we've seen for a while. We've got players that are in their own right kind of world leaders in their positions, people like Harry Kane, the captain, and so on. And why has that happened? It's because they didn't spunk the money on more world-class managers trying to fix a ceiling roof or something, like trying to fix a leaking roof or something. They actually invested in the very heart of things, into the very infrastructure of things, and then the problems started taking care of themselves. So those are my two observations.
Jazakallah khair, Mohsin. So let's take each of those in turn. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying the first point is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He incentivizes us to give charity, and that is because it's good for the community. Is that how I understood the point correctly?
Basically, yeah. So because charity is an important element in society, practically speaking, we need to be incentivized in some way to make sure that that happens. So yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that uh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has given this extreme reward because he wants to bring about a world in which human beings flourish. And an important part of flourishing is to have that velocity of money, to have that movement of money. And that could either be done through commerce or it could be done through giving. And the charity verses are all about making sure that velocity of giving is at a premium. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so my question there is that, and this kind of nicely comes on to the topic that I wanted us to kind of grapple with, and that is that two topics. One is, are we being too instrumental about how we approach charity? This is a question really for me and you and for other people who are talking about impact charity as opposed to just doing charity the traditional sense, the traditional way. Are we being too utilitarian, too consequentialist, too mathsy about the approach that we're taking? Because this analysis that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has encouraged us to give charity, and that's because, or at least in part, that's because of the really good outcomes that charity brings about. Don't you think that could be that could come back to us as you're being too consequentialist, or you're being too utilitarian? You're just stripping the spirit out of it.
Do you mean, so you mean as opposed to charity is just a good act, and we should focus on the good stuff that it does for us rather than focusing or worrying too much about external impact? Is that
Yeah,
what you're saying?
yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely part of it, and also uh, I think there is that separate element of why are we focusing internally, but also why are we caring really about the downstream of the charity? Because we don't really know what's going to happen downstream. We don't really ultimately have control over what where that money gets to and the impact that it can have. Number two, even if we do and we really think about it and we really think about having an impact, actually, just because of the finite data that we have and the lack of 2020 vision and the lack of the ability to see how all sorts of variables are going to play out, really we don't know what is going to have maximum impact.
Hmm. So I agree, and I think it basically falls on what you think as a Muslim your role is in society. And I say that because I think if you are somebody who, and I think a lot of people fall into this category, and I don't think it's either bad or good. But I think that basically people fall somewhere in the spectrum of, on one hand, you are your own person, you focus on yourself, worry about your own deeds, and that's basically it. Kind of keep yourself to yourself approach. And for those people, and I think that I probably used to fall in this category about 10 or so years ago, um, where I very much used to take that approach with charity of, I'm giving charity, my intention is clear, and I do it in the expectation that I will be rewarded for it, and I'm not really that concerned actually with what happens further down the line with that money. Since then, my thinking has changed. I won't say evolved because that implies a positive. It might be a negative thing. My thinking has changed to thinking that actually my duty as a Muslim, and at that a kind of privileged Muslim in the context of the UK community, well educated, good job, and so on and so forth. My duty
Good
actually
looking.
is, sorry.
Good looking.
Well, maybe not quite, but we can't have everything. Um, my duty in this, privileged position is actually to have a maximum positive impact on the people around me and, society at large as best that I can. And given that that is my position, it naturally falls that when it comes to money and charity specifically, I worry and I think quite hard actually about what it takes to do charity in an effective manner. So, in answer to your question, I think it basically depends on what sort of person you are, and I think that I don't want to go as far as to say that we should all be in that latter category because you know I don't think everybody is going to be in that category. Um, and I don't want to kind of make judgments on people that are just perfectly happy doing their own thing and they do good a'mal and they do good things here and there,
But
but they're
why?
very much kind of focused on themselves. Um, so yeah, I think it just depends on what your thinking actually is in terms of what you believe your role to be.
But why do you say that? So now to put to put the shoe on the other foot, surely, and turning to this whole internal external thing, surely it's quite selfish to just focus on the internal and not focus on the external. Um,
Yeah, so I think the argument that one would make for that is that I've got enough deficiencies and enough weaknesses and so on, or complete lack of time to do something effectively. I don't think it's a particularly strong argument personally, um, because I think that if people really think about it hard, there's always something that you can be doing. Um, but I don't think everyone falls on this idea of I need to have this kind of, you know, big societal impact. I can have impact, but it can be in my own little way, whether it's kind of, giving some time to the local masjid or the local soup kitchen or whatever it is, volunteering at a hospice or something. That's impactful as well. Um, but I think that when the way we're talking about charity is kind of, big wave change, kind of big societal movement in how we think about charity, I don't think that everyone is quite ready for that. And for that reason, I think that this whole question, like I say, it falls on where you lie on that spectrum. If you're on the spectrum, I think that we're at, then very much I think the focus is impact because it's just the idea that we've got so much money that we can, so much potential that we can harness, and if we could harness that effectively, then why would you not do it as effectively as you can, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that if you're, every person is going to have a different level of impact, and every person is going to, different people have different time constraints and different mental capacities and different priorities and different focuses and different approaches. And all of that is going to mean that you're going to have a different analysis to the next man, and it might not be as deep an analysis, it might not be as focused analysis, it might not be as detailed, and you've invested the relevant time into it. But as long as you, given your circumstances, are having some thought at least to creating a degree of impact, then I think that that probably does it. And so I suppose what we're saying is that you do need to look at the internal. Charity is an action that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about as a benefit to the individual himself. لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. You will not achieve bir, you will not achieve piety until you spend from that which you love. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not focusing there on the external. He's not saying that you will not achieve piety until you eradicate malaria from Africa or you have the maximum impact. He is saying that you will not achieve piety until you spend from that which you love. as in the individual. So I think there is a strong element of the internal within charity giving.
Can I just add something that's just come to mind? And you'll be in a better place to understand the kind of fiqh on this area. But when it comes to zakat specifically, am I right in thinking that there is a kind of added obligation about the end recipient in terms of making sure that they're valid and so on and so forth? And given that that is the case, or correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't that highlight in some way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is placing emphasis on the fact that you do need to do some sort of due diligence? And if we accept that that's the case, then we should, I think it's a natural extension from there to say that due diligence as a general theme when it comes to charity is important. And if it's important, then we should do it to the very best of our ability. And that means everything that we're saying, which is think really long and hard about strategy and maximum impact and so on. So yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. This is something that I was reflecting on as well. So there's the 8 categories of zakat, and zakat is something that I've studied a little bit, but it's something that is a vast subject area, and there are people who really just focus completely on zakat and have studied that in really great depth. Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi has his PhD thesis, his 2-volume book on zakat and how you give zakat and how it all works. So that's a fantastic read. You can get it online. It's English translation as well, online for free as a PDF. So do check that out. But you're right. So zakat is the counterpoint to my initial verse, which is "Lan tanalu al-birra hatta tunfiqu mimma tuhibbun." You won't achieve piety until that you spend from that which you love. Because zakat said, "Innama sadaqatu lil-fuqara wal-masakin wal-amilina alayha," to the end of the verse. Sadaqah is talking about zakat in this context, is for these 8 categories. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is specifying that these are the people that you spend on, and there's people who would analyze that as saying that this is in order of preference. There are people who would analyze this as saying that these are the things that are required for a society to really flourish. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really prioritizing these things. And there are people who will say that we need to really carefully think about the end recipients. And I think that's right. I think that ultimately this debate about what's more important in charity, the impact externally or the impact internally on us, I think ultimately it comes down to there's a bit of both, right? There has to be a bit of both, and you can have a bit of both in everything. You can very impactfully spend from that which you love. And I think that if you take away nothing else away from this podcast, it's that line. You can impactfully spend from that which you love. And if you do that, then that really is a Quranic way of giving charity. And I think one final thing to add into this whole impact thing, and perhaps I don't think we're going to get through all of the things that we set out to do, because I think this is an important topic and it's good that we spent a bit of time on it. But one final thing to mention on this first segment, which is, why is charity such a big deal? Why is it so important? And this whole impact narrative that we're exploring is that charity has many forms, and one potential form of charity could be a form of enterprise as well. And so we're now talking about these social enterprises that have come about, and that mix an element of charity with an element of business and sustainability as well. And sometimes it's called impact investing. And impact investing may or may not have any charitable component, but it usually does. And there's a academic paper that I was reading on this, and it had a fascinating excerpt that I want to share with you guys. And he says, many mainstream investors reject the idea that they should pay attention to the social impact of their investing, insisting such considerations are the domain of governments and charities. Most traditional philanthropists and policymakers, in turn, reject the idea that they should use their investments to advance their mission, or that business businesses generating profits have a right to stand alongside philanthropists and civil society in the noble work of promoting equality and justice. And so there's two sides to this debate. One side is that, you know, you've got the purebred commercial blue-blooded investor who doesn't want to get any involvement into charity mixed up with his investment. And then you've got the philanthropist, or you've got the charity giver, the traditional charity giver that we've been talking about, who doesn't want to mix in any element of business or any element of impact thinking or any element of being utilitarian or consequentialist or deeply analytical into their charity. They just want to give charity and just do charity the way they have been. And actually, when the two things are combined, you could potentially have a much greater impact and a much more sustainable and long-term impact, because both Mohsin, you and I, we both know that there is nothing quite as motivating for human beings as having that profit incentive and having a sustainable business, as opposed to having a one-off, you know, charitable endeavor where people work hard for a period of time, but it's very, very rare. There's very few people in the world where they will be working on that charitable endeavor for the rest of their lives in a sole focused and consistent way. Most people will do charity, but as a part-time thing, but very few people will be focused on it. And that means that charity loses out. That means that those social enterprises and those activities that they're focusing on, those problems that they're trying to solve, they miss out. They don't get the best of an individual's activity, the best of the individual's talents, the best of the individual's time, the best of the individual's focus. It's always a part-time thing. And so having a impact investing approach, or having an approach of social enterprise, I posit, and Mohsin, you feel free to disagree or present any other argument against it. I posit that is actually a really impactful way of doing charity. What do you think?
So the idea of mixing kind of enterprise and charity is impactful, is what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, agreed. And I think when you were reading that excerpt, I was thinking actually that on one hand, I think you've got people who are thinking a bit like us, kind of about strategy and so on when it comes to charity, which is the first bit of the excerpt that you shared, and then the second bit is about, you know, the traditional charity givers. And I was thinking there about your kind of uncles down the masjid, who, you know, if we were to go down the local masjid and kind of posit our theories onto them, you know, some might be receptive to it, but I strongly suspect the vast majority would think that this is, you know, some kind of crazy left field, you know, symptom of the problem with modern society, trying to mingle, you know, investment and enterprise and so on with charity, this pure essence of charity. But actually, what we're saying is that, you know, they very well can be co-mingled, and they probably should be. If we look at all the problems that we've got, how can we tackle them effectively? You know, this is probably one of the key ways that we can do this.
Agreed. And there are also things to balance out here. The first is, of course, there is a degree of tension between the charity motive and the profit motive, and but actually, and let's put that into real terms. What that means is, if you are a charity, then you know that you are essentially getting that money and giving it out to the end donors, and you need to do that as efficiently as possible. As a business, you have a lot more leeway, where you are trying to maximize the profits for the shareholders, and so you need to make sure that your directors and your employees have the necessary salaries that keep them motivated, but also you want to make sure that the long-term growth of the business is there, so you're investing in that, and you want to give back a little bit to the shareholders. So there's a different dynamic there. And the problem that you have when you try and mix the two things is that a business will ultimately want to be sustainable and make profit, whereas a charity wants to give money to the poor. And when you try and mix the two things, you could have a situation where you are you are focusing on the short-term rewards, and you're increasing the salaries of the individuals who are running this enterprise, and actually the end result is suffering. So that's the nub of that tension. But actually, I think that this tension ultimately exists in a pure charity as well, because in a pure charity you have employees as well, right? And you've got that tension there about is this just a really great employment gig for the people who run this charity, or is this a truly beneficial charity that has a great deal of impact on the world? I think that same tension exists there. So ultimately, I think this is something that is addressable. This tension that people get concerned about. I think you're right. I think uncles will not be hugely receptive of this, and I think part of me kind of agrees with them as well, and that's because if we are going to do something like this, if we are going to try and mix impact investing with enterprise, with charity, and create a kind of social enterprise, then it does often come at the expense of that internal element about, لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. It comes at the expense of having to really do that sacrifice of spending from that best of what which you love, because ultimately, if you are actually benefiting or you're making it sustainable, this charity, then maybe you're not losing out as much as you would otherwise be, and it's the losing out that has the great deal of reward associated with it. So I think there is an element of truth there, but also at the same time, I think it can be done in a way that works, and in a way that actually balances things out overall. So Mohsin, I'm aware of the time, and we've got two further sections to go, which I don't think we're going to get through today. So I was wondering, should we turn to action points, given that this is the last few days of Ramadan, and think about what are the tangibles that we can tell people that will materially help, inshallah, better our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, you'll have your own thoughts, but I was thinking about two things. One of which we've not really touched on, but it's not a big curveball or anything. So the first is a fairly obvious one, in the sense that we've been talking about strategy and impact and all that sort of stuff, and we've kind of been talking about it in relatively fluffy terms. But really, we should sort of expand on what we actually mean. And these aren't kind of finalized thoughts in any way, shape, or form, but as a very kind of basic example as to the sort of chain of thinking that I have, and Ibrahim, feel free to chip in with your thinking as well. So I think the process goes something like this. You identify a problem that we have within society. So let's say, for example, to give an example I gave to someone a few days ago, if we said, for example, we don't have enough politicians, good Muslim politicians, representing us at the very top level. We want someone who is genuine contender to be prime minister material. How do we actually address that? What does that actually look like? And then sit down and map out how you think that best looks. And that might mean not just thinking, it might mean actually, if you've not got necessarily the kind of understanding or the capability of understanding, you need to reach out and network and talk to people who would know about how you get into these top positions. They might say, for example, oh, you definitely need to go to either Oxford or Cambridge. Whether that's right or wrong, then then the problem becomes, okay, fine, how do we then make sure that good young Muslim candidates go to Oxford and Cambridge? And then you kind of carry on down that chain to get to the point where we have got good people that are capable of becoming the prime minister and so on. And then you think about, how do we actually how do we help them get through all of that? And part of that, for example, might be a lot of grants to good children, to make sure they don't drop out of uni or drop out of school or whatever, and so on and so forth. So that, when we talk about this sort of thing, that's the kind of chain of thinking that we're actually talking about. Do you agree with that, Ibrahim?
Yeah, completely. I think there's a really good PDF that I came across. I think if you search for a theory of change by NPC, so that's November Polo
Charlie.
Charlie. There we go. NPC. Then you'll find it. And this is a document that outlines a theory of change that is used by a lot of charities these days, where they're trying to develop a vision that has impact. And I think that this is useful for all of us to have a look at when we are looking at our own charitable giving, but also, frankly, our careers as well, and how we can give our time, which is the most precious thing, towards things that are going to make a genuine impact. But I think, inshallah, we'll probably be able to dig into that a lot more thoroughly in future podcasts, where I think we're going to continue talking about this topic.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to share was kind of just bringing it back to the stuff we were talking about earlier about internal impact. And although we've talked a lot about external, the internal is important. And at the time of recording this, we've got Eid coming up on Tuesday or Wednesday. And we were talking about this the other day about giving gifts, and in many ways that's a form of charity as well. And Eid is a great time of year, and it should be a great time of year, especially for the kids. And for example, with me and my two boys, we don't make a big deal about birthdays and all that sort of stuff throughout the year. And obviously there's a lot of hype around Christmas and all this sort of stuff, and it's only normal that kids do get wrapped up in that hype, especially as they go to nursery and school and so on.
Right.
And it's really, really important, and I really want to encourage everyone to go as far as you can, especially when it comes to kids, but not just kids, to everyone, all your loved ones, to making Eid really quite special. And one really easy way of doing that, well, it's not particularly easy because it needs some thought, but one definitely practical way of doing that is by giving really good gifts. And for the men who are listening, traditionally we're not the best gift givers. And some women aren't as well. I think it's a common problem, perhaps on both sides. But if we really sat down to think about it, not like the day before Eid or something, then we can give really good, thoughtful gifts, and that doesn't need to be expensive gifts. Thought is really all that's required, and I think that is a really, really nice way of doing something and going back to that verse and spending from that which you love on your loved ones, on what is undoubtedly a really special day. So yeah, those are my two thoughts.
Jazakallah khairan, Mohsin. Completely agreed. And that's something that I need to really work on myself as well. But I have, as you know, actually bought a gift for Eid this time, so that's a good start. And on that bombshell, Jazakallah khairan everyone for tuning in. And please do share this podcast, the YouTube video, with your friends and loved ones and whoever you think would benefit from this, inshallah. And please do take the time out to leave us a review on iTunes or whatever podcast platform that you listen to us on, because even if it's just a few words, that really does make a massive impact. And we're talking about impact, so it creates a massive impact for us, and helps us reach as many people as we possibly can. So
and share it with some uncles as well. See what they think.
Yeah, share it with your uncle, share it with your dad, and ask him what he thinks about this. And if he thinks it's a load of nonsense, then let us know, because we'll address that. All right. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.